the land itself carrying the smell of snow iron cold and old memories that never truly left the West in that wide stretch of forgotten country where fence posts leaned like tired men and the horizon felt endless. A single cabin stood alone, weathered and bowed by years of storm, silence, and stubborn survival. It was the kind of place maps forgotten, time avoided, yet the land remembered every footstep that had ever crossed it. Inside the cabin, Eleanor Briggs moved slowly, her boots soft against the wooden floor, worn smooth by decades of living and waiting. The walls held the color of smoke and age, and the beams above her head groaned with each breath of wind as if the house itself was alive. And uneasy Christmas had come again, though nothing about the day felt different from the long line of days before it. No laughter, no visitors, no smell of a feast, just the hush of winter pressing close. She set a single plate on the table, her hands steady, though her chest felt tight. The table was heavy oak, scarred by years of meals once shared with a man who had laughed easily and worked hard from sunrise to dusk. She could still see him there, in her mind broad shoulders dust on his coat, eyes full of plans for land cattle and a future that once felt unbreakable. The chair across from her remained empty and had for many seasons now. Outside, the prairie stretched wide, and white snow drifting across the ground like a burial cloth laid gently by the sky. Fence lines disappeared under the weight of winter, and the cattle trails that once cut through the land were nothing more than faint memories beneath the frost. The world beyond the hills carried on with light songs and warm rooms, but none of it reached this place. Eleanor had stayed when others left. She had held on when there was little left to hold. Years earlier, this land had been alive with sound. Hooves thundered across the fields, and men called to one another under open skies. The ranch had breathed like a living thing, rising with the sun, resting at dusk, and Eleanor had been part of its heartbeat. Alongside her husband Samuel, together they had faced drought, fire, sickness, and debt, and together they had believed that grit could outlast anything. Then sickness came, quiet and unforgiving, and took Samuel with it, leaving the land and Eleanor both struggling to stand. The ranch faded piece by piece, sold to men who spoke in numbers and contracts. Eleanor signed papers with hands that shook not from fear, but from knowing that something sacred was slipping away. What remained was this cabin, a final stand against a world that moved too fast to notice those it left behind. She told herself it was enough, told herself she did not need more, yet nights like this made the truth impossible to ignore. The fire crackled low, casting long shadows across the room. Eleanor wrapped her shawl tighter and sat down at the table across from the empty chair. She bowed her head, not sure who she was speaking to anymore, but words came anyway, carried on habit and hope. She asked for strength, for warmth, for one morning where the sun still rose and she could greet it. Far beyond the cabin, where the prairie bent into rolling hills, a lone rider cut through the storm. His name was Caleb Holt, though few spoke it these days. He rode with the quiet confidence of a man shaped by long days and longer nights, his coat dusted white by snow, his hat pulled low against the wind. The horse beneath him was strong and sure-footed, moving forward as if guided by instinct rather than reins. Caleb had grown up on land much like this, learning early that the West did not care about comfort or fairness, only endurance. He had buried friends, watched towns rise and fall, and seen how easily people vanished from memory, yet something about the light ahead caught his eye, a single glow trembling against the dark. It was not on his route and not marked anywhere, but it pulled at him all the same. He slowed the horse, watching the cabin emerge from the storm like a ghost refusing to fade. The light in the window flickered weak but steady, a sign of life in a place most had abandoned. Caleb felt a tightening in his chest, a feeling he had learned not to ignore. Out here you trusted your instincts or you paid the price. He turned the horse toward the cabin, the wind howling louder as if to challenge the choice. Back inside, Eleanor rose from the table, startled by a sound that did not belong, the crunch of hooves on snow, followed by the low snort of a horse. Her heart hammered as she moved toward the door. No one came this way, not anymore. The world had taught her caution, but also taught her that fear could not be allowed to rule the night. The knock came strong and certain, cutting through the quiet like a blade. Eleanor froze for a breath, her hand resting against the door. The fire popped behind her, and the wind pressed harder against the walls. She opened the door slowly, and the cold rushed in, carrying snow and the scent of leather and horse. A man stood there, tall and still, his coat heavy with snow, his eyes calm beneath the brim of his hat. He removed it with care. holding it against his chest as if stepping into a church rather than a stranger's home. He did not speak at first, only met her gaze with a look that held respect and something deeper, a recognition that this place and this woman mattered. The land outside seemed to pause, the storm easing just enough for the moment to breathe, two lives shaped by the same unforgiving. West stood facing one another, neither knowing that this night would mark a turning. The empty table behind Eleanor waited, and the road behind Caleb stretched long and uncertain, yet here at the edge of the prairie where loneliness had ruled for too long, something old and powerful stirred. The West had always been a place of endings, but sometimes if the wind shifted, and the night allowed, it could also be a place of beginnings. The cold stood between them, heavy and sharp as a blade. Eleanor felt it rush past her boots and wrap around her ankles as the door opened wider. The man did not step forward, instead he waited as if the choice belonged to her alone. Snow clung to his coat and beard, his horse shifting behind him, slow and patient, like it understood this was not a place for haste. The lantern light spilled out across the porch and caught the lines of his face, weathered but calm, the kind of face shaped by long rides and hard seasons. Eleanor studied him the way the West had taught her to read men, by their stillness rather than their words. His hands were bare, despite the cold, scarred and strong, with no tremble in them. His eyes held no hunger, no fear, only a quiet resolve that reminded her of men she had known long ago, men who respected land and silence in equal measure. He finally spoke, his voice low and steady, cutting clean through the wind. I saw your light and thought I ought to check on it. Not many folks left out this way. His words carried no demand, no expectation, just an offering of presence. Eleanor felt her shoulders ease before she could stop herself. She stepped back and held the door wider. Come in. Then she said the words, surprising her with how natural they sounded. The stranger nodded once and crossed the threshold, removing his hat again. As he entered, the cabin seemed to inhale around him, the fire flaring slightly as if welcoming another soul into its warmth. He set his saddlebag gently by the door, careful not to track too much snow inside. The horse outside stamped once, then grew still. Eleanor closed the door and latched it, the sound echoing louder than she expected, sealing the night out and something new in. For a moment neither of them moved. The room felt smaller, now filled with the presence of another person after so many years of solitude. The stranger glanced around, taking in the worn furniture, the tools on the wall, the empty chair at the table. He looked but did not pry. Eleanor noticed that and felt a flicker of gratitude. Name is Caleb Holt, he said at last. Rancher from the South Ridge, was heading into town before the storm turned mean. Eleanor nodded slowly. Eleanor Briggs. She replied. Her name sounded strange in the air, spoken to someone who was not memory. Caleb's eyes softened at that. He glanced at the table, then back to her. I hope I'm not intruding, he said. I can be on my way if you'd rather. Eleanor shook her head once firm. You're not intruding, she said. The words felt like truth as soon as they left her mouth. She gestured toward the table. I don't have much to offer, she added, but there's warmth at least. Caleb gave a small smile. That's more than enough most nights, he said. They sat across from one another, the empty chair between them no longer a symbol of absence but of space waiting to be filled. Caleb opened his saddlebag and pulled out a loaf of bread wrapped in cloth, along with a small bundle of dried meat and a tin of coffee. Eleanor stared at it, her breath catching just slightly. Figured someone might need it more than town, he said simply. Eleanor did not trust her voice, so she nodded and reached for a knife. The bread broke clean beneath her hands, the sound loud and comforting. She placed pieces on both plates, the table no longer bare. As they ate, the storm pressed against the cabin, but did not feel so close anymore. The fire warmed the room, and the light danced across the walls, bringing old memories into motion. Caleb ate slowly, savoring each bite like a man who knew hunger well. They spoke of simple things at first, the weather, the land, the way the herds had shifted over the years. Caleb told her about rebuilding his ranch from near ruin, about fences mended by hand and cattle raised with patience rather than force. Eleanor listened, drawn to the sound of work and purpose in his voice. She found herself telling him things she had not spoken aloud in years, about Samuel and the ranch and the day the papers were signed. She spoke without bitterness, only honesty, and Caleb listened without interruption, his gaze steady, his presence grounding. Outside, the wind softened and the snow fell quieter now, like it was settling in for the night. The cabin felt warmer, fuller than it had in a long time. Eleanor realized she was not counting the hours anymore, not waiting for sleep to take her away from the ache of the day. When the cups were empty and the plates cleared, Caleb rose and pulled on his coat. I should check on my horse before it gets any colder, he said. Eleanor stood. As well, a sudden weight pressing into her chest at the thought of the door opening again. Caleb noticed and paused. I'll be nearby if the storm worsens, he said. I know a shelter down the ridge, and if you need anything, he added, you won't be alone tonight. Eleanor met his eyes and nodded. Thank you, she said, meaning more than the words could hold. He stepped out into the night and the door closed softly behind him. Eleanor stood still, listening to the quiet that followed. It was not the same silence as before. It felt different, like a pause rather than an ending. She returned to the table and looked at the second cup, still warm. The West had taken much from her, but tonight it had given something back. Not answers, not promises, but the simple reminder that even in the wildest, loneliest corners of the old frontier, lives could still cross and change one another. Outside, the lantern light glowed steady against the dark, and the prairie watched as it always had, waiting to see what would come next. The storm did not leave all at once. It loosened its grip slowly, as if unwilling to release the land it had claimed. Snow still whispered across the ground, but the wind softened and the sky above the cabin began to open, revealing faint stars that watched in quiet patience. Eleanor stood by the window, her shawl pulled close, listening to the distant sound of Caleb moving around his horse, each step measured and calm. She had not realized how sharp the loneliness had been until it eased its hold. The cabin felt warmer, not just from the fire, but from the simple truth that someone else now shared the night. The West had always been unforgiving, yet moments like this reminded her why she had stayed, why she had endured when others walked away. Outside, Caleb brushed the snow from his horse, checking the saddle and reins with practiced care. The animal trusted him fully, lowering its head and breathing steady. Caleb rested a hand against its neck, feeling the strength beneath the skin. He glanced toward the cabin light, glowing soft and steady against the dark prairie, a place like that did not survive without a strong soul inside it. He remembered this land from years ago, when cattle moved like dark rivers across the plains, when voices carried far and laughter echoed under open skies. He had ridden past this stretch more than once back then, always seeing the ranch alive with motion. He had wondered what became of it, but never thought he would find the answer on a storm-heavy Christmas night. Caleb secured the horse in the shelter of a low stand of trees nearby, then stood still for a moment, letting the quiet settle around him. The prairie at night held a kind of truth. No man could escape out here. You faced yourself with nothing to hide behind. He felt something stir in him, a sense of responsibility that went beyond chance or curiosity. Inside, Eleanor stoked the fire and set another log in place. The flames caught quickly, lighting the room with a steady glow. She moved with more ease now, her steps lighter. She poured fresh water into the kettle and set it near the fire, then paused, realizing she was preparing for company again. Without thinking, she sat at the table and let her hands rest against the worn wood. Memories rose, uninvited. Samuel sitting across from her, his voice filling the room, his laugh strong and warm. She did not push the memory away. Instead, she let it sit beside her like an old friend finally welcomed back without pain. The sound of the door opening drew her attention. Caleb stepped inside, removing his hat and stamping the cold from his boots. The air shifted as he entered the cabin once more, carrying the scent of snow leather. An open land storm's easing, he said quietly. Should be clear by morning. Eleanor nodded. I was thinking the same, she replied. Her voice surprised her, steady and sure. They sat again, the fire between them casting long shadows that moved slowly across the walls. Caleb leaned back, letting the warmth sink into his bones. He spoke of his early days riding herd as a boy, sleeping under stars, learning to read the land, the sky, and the silence. Eleanor listened, drawn into the rhythm of his words. She shared stories of the ranch when it was whole, of dawn rides and long days of work, of evenings filled with tired laughter and shared meals. The words came easier now, as if the night itself urged them forward. The kettle began to steam, and Eleanor poured them each a cup. The simple act felt meaningful, a small ceremony marking the crossing of something unseen. They drank in comfortable quiet, listening to the fire and the distant hush of the prairie. As the night deepened, the storm finally released its hold. Clouds drifted apart, and the stars shone clearer, brighter than Eleanor remembered. She rose and opened the door, beckoning Caleb outside. The cold was sharp but clean. The sky stretched endless above them, filled with light, untouched by towns or roads. The prairie lay still beneath its blanket of snow. Vast and patient, Caleb tilted his head back and breathed deep. There's nothing like this anywhere else, he said softly. Eleanor nodded. The land listens, she said, even when we think it's forgotten us. Caleb glanced at her, surprised, then smiled. Like it's waiting, he replied. They stood side by side, neither feeling the need to fill the silence. The moment felt suspended, caught between what had been and what might come. The West had a way of shaping people, not with kindness but with truth, and tonight it offered something rare, a moment of shared understanding. Eventually the cold pressed them back inside. Caleb took a blanket from his saddlebag and laid it near the fire. "I can sleep here," he said. "If that's all right." Eleanor hesitated, only a breath, then nodded. The cabin had sheltered many things over the years. Hardship, grief, endurance, it could shelter this as well. She prepared her bed in the small adjoining room, then paused at the doorway, looking back at the firelit space. Caleb sat near the hearth, his hat resting beside him, his gaze thoughtful yet calm. "Good night," she said quietly. He looked up and met her eyes. "Good night, Eleanor," he replied, using her name like it belonged in his mouth. She lay awake for a time, listening to the steady crackle of the fire and the even rhythm of another presence in the room. Her thoughts drifted not to loss, but to the road ahead, to mornings not yet lived. Outside, the prairie rested beneath the stars, unchanged, yet never the same. A new thread had been woven into its long story, two lives crossing paths under a winter sky. The night carried on, holding its breath, as if aware that something old had shifted and something new had begun. Dawn crept in, slow and quiet, the kind that belonged only to the Old West, where the sun rose with patience rather than promise. Pale light slipped through the cabin window, touching the rough walls and resting gently on Eleanor's face. She woke not with the weight she had carried for years, but with a strange calm, as if the night had taken something heavy from her shoulders. For a moment she lay still, listening. The fire had burned low, but its warmth lingered. The cabin no longer felt hollow. Instead it felt anchored, filled with a presence that had not been there before. She could hear movement from the main room, boots shifting, wood creaking, careful and respectful. Caleb was already awake. He stood near the door, tightening his coat and checking the supplies he had set aside. His movements were quiet, deliberate, shaped by years of mornings that began before the world stirred. When Eleanor stepped into the room, he turned and offered a small nod. "Morning," he said, his voice low and steady. "Morning," she replied, surprised again by how natural it felt. The word did not echo with loneliness, as it once had. Instead, it settled into the room like it belonged. She stirred the fire back to life and set about preparing what little breakfast remained. Bread from the night before warmed near the flames. Coffee simmered, filling the cabin with a scent that spoke of endurance and shared roads. They sat together once more at the table, the light now strong enough to reveal the fine lines of age and experience on their faces. Outside, the storm had passed completely, leaving the prairie untouched, and shining snow lay smooth across the land, catching the early light like a field of glass. The world felt paused, waiting to see what would follow. Caleb broke the quiet. "I'll be heading out soon," he said. "Town will be stirring by now." Eleanor nodded, though something inside her tightened just slightly. She had known this moment would come. Roads always pulled men like Caleb onward. He hesitated, then added, "I ride this way often. If you'd have it, I could stop in from time to time, check on things, lend a hand where it's needed." Eleanor met his gaze, searching his face for obligation or pity. She found neither, only sincerity. "I'd like that," she said simply, and she meant it. After breakfast, Caleb stepped outside to saddle his horse. Eleanor followed, pulling her shawl close against the cold air. The prairie stretched wide and clean, the tracks from the night already softening under the sun. Caleb worked with ease, securing straps and checking the horse's hooves. Eleanor watched him, noticing the way he treated the animal, not as a tool but as a partner. The West had taught her to recognize good men by how they treated what depended on them. Before mounting, Caleb paused and reached into his saddlebag. He pulled out a small bundle wrapped in cloth. "Supplies," he said, "enough to last you a while until I pass through again." Eleanor accepted it, her hands firm, her pride intact. This was not charity, it was something closer to kinship. They stood facing one another, the land wide and quiet around them. Words felt unnecessary. The prairie had already heard what mattered. Caleb mounted and turned his horse toward the open land, then looked back. "I'll see you soon, Eleanor Briggs," he said. Eleanor smiled, a real smile, one that reached her eyes. "I'll be here." "Caleb Holt," she replied. He tipped his hat once and rode off, his figure moving steady against the white horizon. Eleanor watched until he disappeared into the distance, the sound of hooves fading into memory. She stood there longer than she needed to, breathing in the cold air, feeling the sun on her face. The cabin behind her no longer felt like a last refuge, but like a place still rooted in the living world. Inside, she set the supplies away and began small tasks, sweeping, mending, tending to the fire. Each movement carried purpose, not just survival. The day unfolded quiet and bright, and Eleanor found herself humming an old tune, one she had not remembered she knew. As the sun climbed higher, the prairie shimmered alive with light. The west remained harsh and unyielding, but it had also shown its other face, the one that rewarded patience, endurance, and the courage to remain open even after loss. Eleanor stepped outside once more and looked across the land. The fences still leaned, the fields still lay dormant, yet for the first time in years, she saw not what was gone but what remained. The old frontier had always been a place where lives crossed briefly, then carried on. Yet sometimes those crossings left marks deeper than time could erase. The prairie held such marks in its soil, and now Eleanor carried one in her heart. The day moved forward, and so did she, not rushing, not looking back, but standing steady where she was. The west watched as it always had, silent and vast, bearing witness to another chapter, beginning where an ending had once been written. The days that followed carried a different weight across the prairie, not lighter yet steadier, like a trail finally worn clear after years of drifting snow. Eleanor rose each morning before the sun, not because loneliness pushed her awake, but because purpose had returned. To the cabin and to her bones, she opened the door to greet the cold air and the wide sky, feeling seen by the land rather than swallowed by it. She moved through her chores with quiet resolve, mending a torn fence rail, clearing snow from the path, checking the old well. The work was hard but honest, and the ache in her hands felt earned rather than empty. Each task tied her back to the years when the ranch had breathed and worked beside her. The prairie responded in its own way. Coyotes called in the distance at dusk, and birds returned cautiously, testing the quiet. The land had always known her, and now it seemed to acknowledge her again. Caleb returned 3 days later, his figure appearing on the ridge like a promise kept. Eleanor spotted him from the porch and felt her chest lift before she had time to question it. She stood waiting as he rode closer, his horse steady against the snow. He dismounted with the same respectful calm and nodded. "Afternoon, Eleanor," he said. She smiled and replied, "Afternoon, Caleb." They spoke of simple things, first the weather, the road conditions, the town stirring back to life after the storm. He brought news. Without burden and supplies, without ceremony, the cabin welcomed him like it had been waiting. Together they worked repairing a broken section of fence. Caleb moved with practiced ease, while Eleanor steadied the posts. Their movements found a rhythm, unspoken, shared, born from years shaped by the same unforgiving land. As they worked, Caleb told her of his ranch, of the struggle to keep it standing against men who measured land by profit rather than memory. Eleanor listened, knowing that fight all too well. She shared her fears quietly, not of hardship, but of being forgotten, of leaving no mark behind. Caleb paused and leaned on the fence post, looking at her with a seriousness that carried weight. "Out here, the land remembers," he said softly. "It remembers who stayed, who worked, who cared, even when people forget. The land does not." The words settled deep in Eleanor. She nodded, once feeling something old loosen its grip. They returned to the cabin as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the snow. Eleanor prepared a simple meal, and they ate together. The table, no longer a place of loss, but of shared presence. As evening fell, Caleb rose. "I should head back before dark," he said. Eleanor nodded, though she felt the familiar pull of parting. Once more he hesitated, then spoke. "I will be back soon. There are things I could help with, if you would allow it." "I would," she replied without hesitation. He smiled, then mounted and rode off, his silhouette steady against the fading light. Eleanor watched until he disappeared, then turned back toward the cabin, her steps sure that night she slept deep and dreamless, wrapped in the quiet strength of the land. The weeks passed, and Caleb returned often. Sometimes they worked side by side. Sometimes they sat in silence, watching the prairie breathe. Each visit wove another thread into a connection, neither rushed nor questioned. The land watched, approving. The Old West had always been built on such bonds, not forged by words, but by shared labor, shared silence, and shared storms. Eleanor found herself planning ahead, planting small intentions like seeds. She repaired the roof, cleaned the barn, set aside space for things not yet known. Hope did not arrive loud or sudden. It came slow and steady, like dawn over the plains. One evening, as the sun set red against the horizon, Caleb stood beside her on the porch. The wind moved gently across the land, carrying the scent of earth and distance. "This place still has life in it," he said. Eleanor nodded. "It does," she replied, "and so do I." The prairie stretched endless before them, holding stories older than either of them, yet willing to make room for one more. The West did not promise comfort, but it honored those who endured and remembered who they were. As night settled in, Eleanor felt certain of one thing. The empty table would not return to silence. The land had spoken, and she had listened. The wild frontier carried on as it always had, but now it carried two names where once there had been one. Spring came quietly to the prairie, not with celebration, but with permission. The snow pulled back inch by inch, revealing soil, dark and waiting the wind. Softened and carried the smell of thawed earth across the land. Eleanor felt it in her bones, the same way she once had when life still moved forward with purpose. She stepped outside each morning and watched the horizon change color, knowing the land was turning another page. Caleb arrived more often now, sometimes with tools, sometimes with nothing but time. They worked the fields together, clearing debris, repairing what age and neglect had worn thin. Their hands grew familiar with the rhythm of shared labor, passing tools, lifting beams, setting posts without the need for instruction. The work bound them closer than words ever could. The old barn came back to life under their efforts. Its doors stood straighter, its roof patched strong enough to stand against the coming storms. Eleanor stood back one afternoon and watched Caleb secure the final plank, the sound of the hammer echoing across the open land. It felt like hearing a heartbeat return. They spoke of the past more freely now, of losses that had shaped them and choices that had carved deep paths. Neither tried to fix the other. There was no need. The West did not offer repair, only endurance and understanding. Caleb shared stories of men who had tried to tame the land and failed, and of others who learned to listen and survived. Eleanor spoke of Samuel without sorrow, letting his memory exist without pain. The land held those stories gently, as if they belonged to it as much as to them. One morning Eleanor surprised herself by suggesting they plant again a small plot near the cabin where the soil still held promise. Caleb smiled and agreed without hesitation. They worked the ground together, hands deep in earth, seeds pressed in with care. As the days lengthened, green pushed through the soil, fragile yet determined. Eleanor felt something awaken inside her. She was not simply surviving now, she was building again. Neighbors began to notice. Riders passed and tipped their hats. Some stopped to talk, drawn by the sight of life returning to a place they thought lost. Eleanor welcomed them with quiet pride. The cabin no longer stood alone against the prairie, it stood connected once more. Caleb stayed longer during each visit, sometimes overnight, sometimes for days. There was no announcement, no moment of decision. The change came as naturally as the seasons. One evening, as the sun sank low, painting the sky with fire, Caleb and Eleanor sat on the porch side by side. The land stretched wide before them, alive with the promise of growth. "I never thought I would settle again," Caleb said quietly. Eleanor did not look at him when she replied, "Neither did I." The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of understanding, shaped by the land they both loved. The weeks rolled on, and the prairie bloomed. The planted field took shape, rows of green, standing proud against the open sky. Eleanor worked among them each day, her hands strong, her spirit steady. Caleb brought cattle to graze along the edge of the land, sharing space and responsibility. The old ranch breathed again, not as it once was, but as something new, shaped by loss and resilience. One afternoon, a storm rolled in, sudden and fierce, dark clouds racing across the sky. Caleb and Eleanor moved quickly, securing what they could. Then they stood together on the porch as the rain came heavy and cleansing, soaking the land they had reclaimed. The storm passed as quickly as it came, leaving the prairie fresh and shining. Eleanor laughed then, a sound she had not heard from herself in years. It startled her and then warmed her from the inside out. Caleb smiled, watching her as if the land itself had just spoken. As summer deepened, they rode together across the plains, checking fences, watching the herds moving steady and calm. The West stretched endless around them, harsh and beautiful, demanding and fair. Eleanor realized one evening as they returned home that she was no longer afraid of the future. It did not promise ease, but it offered continuity, and that was enough. The cabin glowed at dusk, warm and welcoming. The table inside held two plates now, without question or ceremony. The West had tested her, taken much, and given little, yet in its own time it had kept its promise to those who stayed, who worked, who listened. Eleanor stood at the door, watching the land settle into night, and felt certain of one truth. The prairie had not finished telling her story, and she was ready to